See that?
Looks good.
Good. Okay. So I'm going to try to do a quick didactic blitz here on where we are with COVID, but particularly where we are with the vaccines. There's no way to do both in a short window, but I'll give you a real quick update. So in Ohio, as of yesterday, because the numbers from today aren't in, obviously, we have had 1.09 million cases and a bit over 19,000 deaths. So it's really not been good, obviously, from that perspective. We are now at about 42% of the population have received at least one vaccine dose, and 36.8%, again, yesterday's numbers, are fully vaccinated. So we are nowhere near the 70 or over 70% that people say are needed for us to actually achieve what they call herd immunity. And yet, of course, rules are being relaxed and so forth. So I'm going to chat a little bit about that as we go. So first and foremost, just by way of backdrop, we have worked on vaccines since 1798. So when somebody says to you, "Oh, this is all new," I start with that. We've understood vaccine concepts, and this is just a quick snapshot. There's obviously a lot of other vaccines along the way, but we've had a lot of vaccines over the years. And in fact, even our current vaccines, that the concepts have been researched for other vaccines, for Zika virus, Ebola virus, and other things of that nature, some of which are coming to fruition as well. So I say this because as this is a healthcare group, many of you are probably going to be in the position of advocating that more people get vaccinated. So I want people to have that background. Hey, this has been going on for a long time. This is not a new concept. This is the only slide that's on the test today. And I'm kidding. But this I thought was interesting. I found this obviously on the web from the Visual Capitalist. This just walks through how we started here approximately January of 2020. The first case we heard about was actually December 31st of 19, and then how this blossomed out to where we are now in terms of both cases, deaths, and attacks on COVID with money and resources and so forth, trying to do this. You're probably all aware that while we're starting to relax a lot of rules here in the country, and as per the governor yesterday in the state, India is having a horrible time. I listened to a webinar yesterday from Harvard where they were talking about India's problems. So just be aware that as much as we all want this to be gone, as a global community, it is far from gone. And I'm not convinced it's all that gone for the United States either. But so the rest of the slides will be a lot easier to deal with. I just put that more as a visual of you've all lived this, how much has really been going on apart from everything we've had to juggle in our personal lives. And that slide kind of captures it, just like a cacophony of items going on. So vaccines, similar in many ways to how we do drug studies. The vaccines, start off, they have multiple phases up through the approval. And in this case, actually, we're not really here in phase 4 with any of these vaccines yet. We're really kind of in the middle here because we have an emergency use authorization, which was basically the FDA looked at these vaccines, and I'm going to talk about all 3 of the ones that have been approved, and said, yeah, we believe the data says that they are safe in particular, that the side effects are not horrible in terms of short-term side effects. There is signs that it's protective. And then, of course, you get into the 1,000 plus. It was about 75,000 individuals for Moderna and Pfizer combined, and then they added another 30 or so for Johnson & Johnson. And of course, now millions have received these medications, or vaccines rather, and we're moving toward approval. For Pfizer, at least, they were the first out of the block. They believe now they've got enough tests, as well as real world tests, to say, let's get rid of the emergency use authorization. Let's make this an actual vaccine. So these are the 3 you've heard about. I've got 2 slides in this that both between them summarize most of the information that we know to date. So Pfizer, working with a subsidiary BioNTech, created the first one that came out of the gate, 2 doses, 21 days apart. And again, that's the research base. You've heard when we were in a shortage that the CDC and FDA jointly They agreed, said, well, we can do them 6 weeks apart and they should still work. They said the same thing about Moderna at the time. J&J was not out yet. And of course, those of you who like to be evidence-based cringed, as I did, because that was not evidence-based. So you can tell us, create a new 6-week window, but nobody studied a shot on day one and a shot 6 weeks later for either of these. So they really did the studies on 21 days apart, 28 days apart. And then, of course, Johnson & Johnson is actually one dose. They've looked at 2 doses. The truth is it's been efficacious enough that I'm not sure they'll ever go to the 2 doses at this point. So, and you can see the amount of doses bought by the US well exceeds what's needed. So, especially considering, so we're actually right now in the process, including Ohio, of giving and or selling doses that we've purchased to other places because we just can't get the population to, excuse me, to agree to come in and get this. Notice this, the 95 and 94% efficacy. That's amazing for a vaccine. And I don't think the government and others did a good enough job explaining how wonderful that is. It isn't as though all vaccines are 100% and these were somehow substandard, but I do think that's where some of the hesitancy comes from, because nobody ever asks, well, how efficacious is the flu shot, right? Because that one has actually had full approval, which means healthcare systems are allowed to mandate it, for example. They cannot mandate an emergency use authorization. And of course, this will get into some controversy soon. Once Pfizer has full approval, you may see health systems begin to mandate everybody to get it. And right now, health systems often are not even at the 70% mark, let alone the 100% mark. So just be aware of that. Talking about COVID is making Nicole Purell her hands, I see. So just the whole concept of this is doing this. So you're the only one I can see on my screen. Everybody else that I see is the black square.
It's lotion, not Purell.
Oh, it's lotion. Okay. Well, that'll kill some germs, I'm sure. Anyway, so and then of course the Johnson & Johnson, then people, oh, it's not strong enough. It's not effective enough. The reality is when you look at all 3 vaccines, that they are virtually 100% effective against keeping you from getting so ill that you'll end up in the hospital and of course, therefore from dying. That's been the fear. That's been the what's resonated in all of mine included minds, right? Nobody wants to suddenly get taken down by some invisible particle. There's been this fear, and I think it's like a fear of the unknown in some level, even though we think we understand viruses, truly we don't understand them well, or we would have better antivirals and so forth. So that's been the fear. So to me, any vaccine, if you can get a vaccine that will keep you from getting so ill you end up in the hospital, I'm going to give you some actual evidence based on that at the end with a study that literally just came out in the last week, showing that is in fact accurate. And in fact, at a higher rate than any of these recommend, it's actually closer to 100% for stopping all illness. So here's another version of this, just to give you a little bit simpler graph, with the same numbers here. By and large, they do have boosters in development. So the other piece that comes up, and I've got more on this in a few moments, are the variants. But I'll just say here that everything that's been looked at with the variants so far, we've not had much studied on the new variant in India, the B1.167 variant. However, everything else seems to be working. So although it is less effective, these vaccines tend to be less effective against the variants. So far, they have appeared to be effective enough to keep people out of the hospital. Again, that's probably the best bar to use as opposed to 100% effectiveness or something to that effect. So the boosters in development, the concept would be that we don't know how long immunity will stay in human beings after they've had the 2-dose or 1-dose regimen 14 days later. So 14 days after that, our bodies should have geared up and made antibodies if they're going to. Almost everybody does. There's a small percentage of people who never do. And that's probably accounts for that 5% variance and so forth. But they've been following people from early on, and we now know, and I think it's actually more like 9 months, they've only published 6 months. At 6 months, individuals still had plenty of antibodies to presume that they are immune. So we're watching that. That's what's going on in the background. Presumably we'll hit at least a year. I think it's fair to bet on that. then that means at very least we would, at most, we would need a shot every year. That could go further. I don't think we know the answer to that yet. Granted, big pharma is behind all this, so there's money to be made. I can imagine they may try a year. If nothing else, the booster won't just be a booster. The boosters would include more spike proteins to attack more variants. And that really might be valuable. And then maybe we'll discover after that that immunity actually lasts for a number of years. Many shots, we get them much later in life as a booster. When I was in college, there was a measles outbreak, and they came around and everybody had to get revaccinated just in case, because almost everybody, of course, had them had the vaccine in childhood. So sometimes we'll do that. You can imagine the same thing happening with COVID. Let's say it becomes a distant memory, which we all look forward to, and 30 years from now, COVID, whatever that would be, whatever year that would be, pops up, and they might decide to give people a booster shot, even though they test people and think, gee, they still have some antibodies. So, and also B and T cell memory and all that kind of stuff. So you'll also see here, this is a slightly older slide. It says 16 plus. They are now at the point where they're allowed to use it in 12, 13, 14, and 15-year-olds. So Pfizer now, again, emergency use authorization. It's not officially approved for them yet, but they've got enough data that they're pushing for this group now to also be vaccinated, because once we had a certain number of adults vaccinated and or ill, having had COVID, and therefore becoming immune, we started to notice that the younger group was the group getting the COVID. I don't think that's too surprising. The virus is basically a parasite. It's going to go into whatever human body it can get into to stay alive. So that, I think that's pretty straightforward for any organism that survives by having a host. In this case, humans being the host, and maybe originally it was in bats. I think there's still a lot of controversy around some of that, and not to worry with, but there's been a lot of issues around storing these vaccines and so forth. That's easiest to store Johnson and Johnson, second easiest. They actually were able to keep this a lot of times in a regular refrigerator, and Pfizer needed actually specialized cooling it with tended to be only hospitals and sometimes health departments that could do that. So pretty good information at this point. Real fast, this is what's in. I'm going to show you all three vaccines. So most of the stuff already, some of the stars I've already told you about, but just so people know what is in this. So of course it's got the messenger RNA of the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein. It's got a bunch of lipids to kind of hold that in suspension. And then it's got preservatives, a little bit of sugar in there. So not much in there. And in fact, from a point of view of allergy reactions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, there really shouldn't be much with the Pfizer. This is Moderna, same idea. Again, these are almost identical, quite frankly, the way they created Moderna, the way they created Pfizer, a little bit different in the background that they use, but basically they're the same kind of vaccine, a little bit different. You may recognize our primary care colleagues, tromethamine, for metabolic acidosis. We sometimes use that in patients to deal with that problem. But so that's in here. Basically, they're creating a buffer solution for the spike protein, which is really all you're trying to get into the human body. And then Johnson and Johnson, they used a slightly different approach. They basically took an adenovirus, a cold virus, if you will, and they altered it so it couldn't actually cause us to get sick from the cold, because of course then you'd give people shots and they'd get sick with the cold, and you'd imagine that would immediately create more hesitancy for others getting it. The ultimate outcome, however, is the same, and I'll show you a graphic in a moment. The ultimate outcome is the same, which is we ultimately end up with mRNA, which causes our bodies to make the spike protein, which causes us to create antibodies. And so the net result is really the same. Again, they also have to have a buffer solution in here and make sure it stays alive. The controversy that you may have heard is stem cells. A lot of issues around stem cells. So I did some reading on this. And number one, no stem cells. So it's in the sense that nobody's out there aborting fetuses, taking stem cells, all that controversial stuff that gets also into religion. So there's a lot of politics and religion get involved in science. We've had way too many politics involved in this whole COVID problem from day one in this country. not so much religion. So we don't need to add religion to that to make it even tougher in this country. But I found this rather interesting, that they basically have two cell lines. There's actually a lot of them in the background, but the ones they used here were two different cell lines from 1985 and 1973. And in the lab, many labs actually, they've kept these cell lines viable. Maybe you can say alive, I'll just say viable, for all this time. And you've got retinal cells here, kidney cells here, and that's what they use when they're testing these things in the background. Lots of things get tested this way, by the way. So it's not stem cells in the sense of the way people are fearing that we're out there harvesting fetuses, or there's some conspiracy to get people to have abortions so we can do this. That is not, just to be clear, in case anybody raises that with you as a religious objection to this. I thought this was interesting, actually. Um, Also, let me just mention the study populations. I've talked a lot about this with our various racial groups in Akron and Summit County, some of whom are more hesitant. And I understand that our science over the years has not been kind to particularly Black individuals. So we've had to really get past that. And they really did, actually, with these study populations. So this is the US population per the 2020 census. And I'll focus on the white versus Black, because that's usually how this controversy plays out. So notice the 13 or so percent. If you look at Pfizer, they actually had about 10% African American. That is way higher than almost any other study I've ever seen. They just don't do well often to get closest or close to the American population. Moderna, very similar in there. They actually had a higher Hispanic population than even exists, but the African American population, they really worked mightily to try to get this breakdown, as did Johnson & Johnson. Again, you'll notice here they actually had an even higher percentage than the American population percentage of African Americans. And I use their wording, so that if they wrote Black or African American, I wrote that exactly from the CDC website. Part of the reason for that is Johnson & Johnson being later to the game tested in more countries. I think they were in 8 countries, several of which were mostly African American countries, being that they were actually in Africa. So they did tests in other continents and got a higher percentage, and that's really good, because obviously that's the people that migrate or immigrate and so forth. So I thought that was great. So from a percentage point of view, and you'll see between the 3 studies, it's something in the 110,000 individuals studied, each of them getting the approval for emergency use authorization. How do these work? This group probably knows this better than most, so I won't belabor it, but it'll be in the slide set. At least you'll have this if you need it. This is directly from the CDC website, so that we've got a reference for it. But again, basically what you're doing is you're tricking the body with the spike protein only. So there's no virus. You can't catch COVID from any of these vaccines. And the mRNA officially are what they're calling Pfizer and Moderna. But in my mind, I'll show you the graphic. The reality is the net result is the same with Johnson & Johnson. It still ends up with mRNA causing us to create the spike protein. And the spike proteins are really what the virus uses to get into our cells and then replicate itself. And when we talk about variants, a lot of that is that those viruses remember, humans evolve very, very slowly, especially when we live to be 80 years or older. And so our rate of progeny is very low, but viruses are replicating extremely rapidly. So I'm not surprised that we have a number of variants in the relatively short window that we've been dealing with COVID, although I know it feels a lot longer than a year and a half. It's something that's gone on. So they're constantly evolving. Of course they are. And so those spike proteins change slightly, and some of them seem to therefore get into our cells easier. So when they talk about easier to transmit or easier to cause illness, that's what they mean. They mean that the virus has evolved. That is really survival of the fittest. It's not right if you think about it. It's really Darwinian. So the ones that have survived the best are the ones that keep going on and replicating, and so on and so forth. So those ones that had slight variations when they replicated, because that's what happens when you keep replicating, you're going to have DNA changes, minor little variations. they end up being easier to get into cells. Guess what? That's the variant. So in the United States right now, actually about 70% of what people are getting is the UK variant. It's completely changed from what we originally had. India, as I said, is now having a problem with their own variant, if you will, because it appears to have evolved in India, where there are a lot of people per square foot compared to this country, where we have a lot of rural spaces and so forth. So they have a particularly large problem there because it's very hard to socially distance and so forth when you're that populated. So again, it does not affect our DNA. The mRNA does not enter the cell nucleus, so we're not creating some weirdness and we're going to turn into that old movie, The Fly, where the fly got in the transmitter type thing, and the guy came out with some DNA from a fly as well as a human. Nothing like that. But I think that's what people fear, and it makes sense. You can't get, again, COVID from this, and you can't get the vaccine and then give COVID to your loved ones, friends, whatever. Right? You don't have it to give, so that's not going to happen. And again, as I said, again, the biggest thing for me, as I talk to other people about their hesitancy, is these have been around and we've been studying them. Actually, if we're looking to do one for flu, the stalk, if you will, not the spikes, so the base of flu, to find one flu vaccine. There can be only one, like the ring. We want to be able to have this master flu vaccine so we can avoid all flu. Now, that has not happened yet, but they're working on it. So this is the Johnson & Johnson, just to give you one graphic. There's not time in this didactic to give you a graphic for each of these, but you can see basically they're using this adenovirus. It is one that has been altered so it can't actually cause illness in humans, and then that travels, obviously, going into the cells. This does actually deal with the nucleus because we need it to create the mRNA. And again, the net result is the same. That mRNA is going to come out, and we're going to be making spike proteins and fragments, and then our bodies are going to create an immune response with all of our immune cells. And the net result is we then have antibodies that are sitting there waiting in the background, the memory cells, as they call them, just like you have memory cells. If you had chicken pox when you were 12 years old, you have memory cells sitting around waiting if you get chicken pox. We believe now that that may wane over time. And so people, when you hit age 50 or older, go in and get a Shingrix vaccine to help you keep those at bay, because that stays in your body in your dorsal root ganglia, so they don't come back out in the form of shingles. All right, so the memory cells are there, but maybe not potent enough after many, many years. And we've learned now that that's the mechanism for shingles. So but that's the idea. We're basically trying all these vaccines to trick the body into creating, saying, aha, foreign object, attack. And then our immune system kicks in. And the net result is we then have antibodies for a period of time. And we ultimately also have memory cells within our immune system that will recognize that virus particle if it enters our body at a later date. And right now, we don't know how long that lasts. That's the issue as far as when do we need I won't say the booster, I'm going to say an update shot, because the booster shot is probably needed simply because there's so many variants out there. So we may all want that at 1 year or thereabouts. But future shots, I think it's the jury's out on what those will be. So the other thing I'll mention in sort of the final piece here, we have a huge and wonderful monitoring system out there. And I shared this in some detail on one talk with Love Akron. There is really unlikely that we're going to not catch something. And we've caught originally 6, now a total of 28, all women that have had blood clots. And potentially they're at least appears to be related, maybe even caused by the vaccine, and the Johnson & Johnson specifically. And they yanked it and they looked at all this for a period of time and said, all right, we think it's extremely rare and we need the vaccine out there. The risk benefit was much more on the favor of benefit. And so they put it back out there. But I can understand why there may be some women in particular who would be more nervous and would be looking for Moderna or Pfizer. That's certainly appropriate if people want to do that. Okay. And then finally this, because again, we are a group of healthcare people here. How do you help people to decide I want to take this vaccine? And my best analogy is technology. right? When the new technology comes out, I'll use virtual reality goggles. When virtual reality goggles first came out, not a lot of people bought them. Number one, they were expensive. Number two, they didn't do a lot. They were kind of odd, and you're not going to have a lot of people buying them. But some people are early adopters. In this case, me included in that. And I think they're fascinating. I never have time to use them. Every time I talk about them, I think, man, I haven't used them in months. But they're fascinating, and I think eventually going to be the way we exercise. Right, you'll be able to exercise and be exercising with your friend and kickboxing or something, but not actually hitting each other. So you're staying safe, but exercising. That kind of stuff is truly on the very soon horizon, I think, actually, at least through the Oculus. And there's a few new ones actually coming out from other companies within the next year. So then eventually, though, people talk about it, hear about it, and more people start to adopt those. And eventually, a lot of people adopt it. You'll still have some who always have refused. Right. So that's kind of my analogy to how this is playing out. It did not help, even though it was six people, which it's six out of millions, but it didn't help to have the Johnson and Johnson yanked because of the nervousness that caused people. On the other hand, it's the right thing to do. And I think, to my mind, it's a great talking point to say, hey, they're going to stop these things if they see anything wrong, and they've just proven it. Right. So if they catch anything in a certain group of people, in this case, it was by sex or by gender, if they catch it in a certain race, if in white people or black people or Asians or whoever, suddenly we see an actual problem, they're going to yank them for that group, and we're going to do more studies. I think people can rest assured that that's what's going to happen. There's, of course, a big national push to empower us, all the healthcare people, to promote confidence. Because, as I said, even hospital systems mostly have not hit 70%, which in theory is the herd immunity needed. Therefore, I really do expect once Pfizer is approved officially, we're going to watch hospital systems, as many have done with flu shots now, where they're going to mandate everybody gets the Pfizer vaccine, or eventually all these vaccines, at least one of them. Um, this is my balance, I think. Right, you're really balancing short term, and now millions and millions of people, and worldwide over 1 billion, have received vaccines, and maybe it's even 2 billion at this point, have received vaccines, and they've mostly, almost entirely, had short term side effects, mostly the arm swelling and pain. And then maybe with the second shot in particular, or the first shot if they've already had COVID, because that means you already have some antibodies, you may get some of a reaction. I personally had a reaction that I didn't notice because I was asleep for the evening, and then in the morning until about 5 o'clock that next day, I didn't have a fever actually, but I had a headache and some tiredness. I didn't feel all that good on a Saturday, but at about 5 o'clock, it was like a light switch flipped, and I felt fine after that. So that's well worth it compared to this, compared to these long-term health effects and long COVID. That's a whole nother lecture. Is a big issue right now. People that have actually had COVID and are having ongoing problems. And you'll notice here, since we're talking integrated care, that there's mental health issues as well as physical issues involved in this. All right. So finally, a little bit of evidence here. This literally just came out, I think, on May 6th. May 6th in JAMA. So they looked at this. They took a bunch of people, over 6,000 healthcare workers. In this case, Pfizer, because they had to go back and with the original ones, people started getting Pfizer way back in late December of a year. Well, yeah. So and so that was important. And they looked at this and noticed this: the ratio for symptomatic infection or an asymptomatic infection, it's tiny. It's just not very. So they're all getting exposed constantly because they're all working amongst people with COVID. And so they found that some did test for it, but even the symptomatic was like nothing. They weren't really majorly symptomatic. And that's my point, is they weren't ending up in the hospital. They needed to actually test people to see if they were showing that they had COVID, because they couldn't tell by saying, oh, I have COVID. They might have said I'm a little tired the last few days, but they really didn't think they had COVID because they've been vaccinated. So they were testing everybody, and both of these were statistically significant. Here's your link to the full article in JAMA. So there really is good evidence coming out even as we speak about this. Just some quick strategies for encouraging people to get the vaccine. And my favorite just got announced by Governor DeWine at the bottom. I never win anything, so I'm hoping for this one. They're going to poll adults from whoever got vaccines starting May 26th. i.e. they're trying to push people in the next 2 weeks, go out and start getting vaccinated. And they're going to pull a name, 5 different names, one each week, and that person's going to win $1 million. That's a pretty good incentive. If you haven't gotten your shot, I'd get right out there on that. So anyway, so be aware of that. The other one is they're going to pull the younger group, because remember, 16, 17-year-olds have also had the opportunity to be vaccinated by Pfizer up to this point, now 12 and up. They're going to potentially get a 5-year full ride college scholarship. Awesome, right? I mean, any parent would be proud of their young one getting that. So I don't care how much money you think you make, that college is not cheap. So you're going to save a lot of money on that. So I mean, what an interesting strategy. We're the only state, by the way, I looked into that's doing this. There are some others that have a few incentives, but those incentives are like $100. And this money, by the way, is coming from COVID relief dollars from the feds that Ohio apparently hasn't needed. So Governor DeWine is going to be unique. I think it's fascinating. Finally, the real reason to get vaccinated, apart from doing your part to help get rid of this pandemic, is it just happened through CDC, we don't have to wear a mask or social distance indoors or outdoors if we're around other people because we're fully vaccinated. That's amazing. I mean, now that's a huge incentive, much more likely to be valuable to all of us than winning the $1 million, which right now is, one in 4 point something million chances of winning, because a lot of, millions have been vaccinated in Ohio, although not nearly enough. You do still have to wear them if you're in crowded settings, right? So ISIS planes are going to continue it. TSA at one point was talking about eliminating the mask rule. I believe they finally said, nope, we're going to continue it. So they've still got the mask rule. But so certain areas, hospitals, of course, that makes sense. Who comes to hospitals? People that are ill. So that makes sense to be extra cautious there. So, and then here's just a few more resources. They changed the website a while back now to make it simple for people. Get the shot, right? So, and if you Google any of this, you can do that. I don't have time for this today, but I found this, Emily Waters. She does this. She's got a website, The Cartoon Shrink. She has got wonderful hand-drawn images of each of the vaccines and how they work on COVID and how it works. I could have given the whole lecture using those, actually, if I didn't go into all these other details for time's sake. So if anybody's interested, those are fascinating and very well done. And they're not quite Garfield, but they're cartoonish enough that I think it works for a lot of audiences to look at that and see, wow, that's what this is. So the picture is worth 1,000 words. That's why I put the link as opposed to showing you those. That'll take another 20 minutes to go through them all. So, and I will take questions.